Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish. Can you believe we're in week 7 already? Yeah, crazy, right? So we have this week, which is our second week going into poetry, and then next week is midterms, which is crazy. This semester is flying by. So the good news, at least on your end probably, is that we do not have a midterm exam in this class. Next week we will be doing a grammar review. That's what we're going to do instead of a midterm, and it's just to check up on everybody's grammar. We're going to be doing our outlines for paper 2 and doing, I think, the reader responses next week as well. We'll double check here when we look at the handouts. But yeah, so we won't have a midterm exam. It'll just be a grammar checkup. Next week, this is week 7, so we do have a discussion forum this week. Next week, since we're doing the grammar review, we won't have a discussion forum. So just make sure that you are checking, and I've got it pulled up here, make sure that you're checking the weekly assignments, you're checking the course content, you're making sure that you're turning everything in on time, and that you're doing every assignment for the week. Right now, everybody is doing okay in the class. I would say that you can always check your grades on the grade book part right here. If your grade is not where you're wanting it to be, then chances are that you're either, 1, not turning in all of your assignments each week, or 2, you're only doing parts of the assignment but not the entire assignment. For example, there are some students that are still only posting the initial discussion forum, but they're not replying to their peers. Or if you didn't turn in paper 1, that was a massive loss of points. All of our papers in our class are worth a lot, so you have to get those turned in. And I am a little bit lenient on the first paper because I know it's a deadline that we think, oh yeah, oops, I forgot to do that. I am not going to be very lenient throughout the rest of the semester, and I don't want your grade to suffer because of that. So please make sure each week, if you have to write down when assignments are due, do it. If you need to get a planner and do it that way, or write a list, or mark it on your calendar, whatever you need to do, just make sure you're turning everything in and you're completing all parts of the assignments, and then you should be on the right track. Those of you that are doing that have an A or B in the class, so kudos to all of you. Before we start finishing up our part 1 of our poetry unit with our presentation, I do, and I've told several of you this when I graded your paper number 1, I did want to go over revising. Now, a lot of you on paper number 1 did awesome. I honestly think that content-wise, these papers were phenomenal. I was so happy with how these papers turned out, because I've had some semesters where papers, I've read them, and I've been like, oh, these are okay. No, this semester, you guys outdid yourselves. So thank you. These were so much fun to read. They were so inspiring. You guys have proven to me already in paper 1 that you can write. And I know some of you are like, oh, I'm not a writer, I'm not that good. No, you guys are capable, very much. This was probably, content-wise, the most solid set of papers I've read in a while. So thank you for that. I say content-wise because a lot of you, if you didn't get an A or a B on your paper, chances are that it was either A, the paper wasn't long enough, we do have a 3-page minimum, or 2, there were some grammatical errors throughout the paper. Now, if it's content, that really comes down to you adding more to the paper. But grammar is a quick fix on revisions. So for papers 1, 2, and 3, I let you all revise your paper. Because as I said in the introduction video, right here, when I was in college, I had professors that you turned a paper in and you got it back with a grade and you really couldn't do anything with it. And I always felt frustrated because as a student, I thought, well, I'm in an English class. My goal should be to become a better writer. So shouldn't I get a chance to revise? And a lot of my professors would not let me do that. So I decided that when I would teach, I was going to give you guys a chance to revise papers 1, 2, and 3. Now, paper 4, our last paper, is due the very last week of class. So you won't get a chance to revise it, but we will be doing peer review. And as it gets closer, we'll talk more about that. But I do give you guys 2 weeks to revise papers 1, 2, and 3. So paper Number one, you all should have back. You should have received that back with a grade by now. They're all graded. And the revised versions of those papers are due Monday, since we have Columbus Day off. They're due Monday, October 8th. So if you revise your paper, and I'm about to show you all how to do that, you can revise it and then just email it back to me. And some of you have actually already emailed your revisions back, which is awesome. Thank you. The earlier you get them back, the earlier I can grade them and change your final grade in that paper. And I always take the highest grade that you receive through those revisions. So I would highly encourage you, if you got an A or a B on the paper, you're fine. I really don't think, you can revise it if you want to. I've had several students in the past that they wanted that 100% on every one of their papers, and so they revised them all. If you want to do that, you are more than welcome to. But I would say if you've received an A or a high B, you're probably fine. I don't think that you have to revise necessarily. It's just optional. If you did get a low B, that's entirely up to you whether you want to revise it or not. If you received a C or a D or below on a paper, I would highly recommend that you do revise, because that is a good chance to increase your grade. Now, I do have one stipulation with revision. You must turn the paper in on time, the first time, in order to be able to revise it. So if you did not turn paper 1 in, you do not get a chance to revise it, because there's nothing to revise. I never received the paper. So you have to be diligent about that. I have had some students in the past that will send me, let's say October 8th, they would send me their paper 1, but they never turned it in on time to begin with. And so I won't accept it. It has to be turned in on time in order for you to get a chance to revise it. All right? So if you missed out on paper 1, don't be turning it in on October 8th. Just focus on paper 2 and keep moving forward. We are still early enough in the semester that you will have a lot of chances to make your grade better. I would honestly say that most of our points in this class are actually in the last quarter of our semester, which is crazy to think. So if your grade is not where you want it to be, you still have plenty of time to make it better. But I would encourage you to start getting into these habits now of turning things in on time, doing the complete assignments, asking questions, emailing me if you have concerns. Start doing that now. Don't wait till the last minute, but you still have lots of time to increase your grade. All right. So with that being said, I will show you how to revise your papers. Now, when I'm at home, like I am now, I have a Mac, a laptop, and so you'll notice probably that my setup is a little bit different than yours. When I'm at my work computer, it's a PC. So there are a little bit of variances there on how you access documents and how Microsoft Word looks. So this version of Microsoft Word is built for a Mac, so it may look a little bit different than yours. But I have pulled up this example paper, and I'm actually going to put this paper onto our week 7 handouts. This is a paper 2 example from a few semesters back, and I've kept it because I like it. And this is actually option 1 that one student chose. So I'm going to put it on our week 7 handouts. But I wanted to show you all how to revise your papers. So when you open up your paper, if you open up paper 1, you need to first make sure you do this on Microsoft Word. If you submitted a PDF, then I gave you your grade, but I can't edit PDFs, so you probably will not see any edits. So fortunately, there really weren't any papers that really needed revision that were submitted as PDFs. So you all are fine if you did that. If you submitted your document as a rich text format or as pages, you need to make sure that you can open it on Word. So you may have to find a PC that has Word in order to open it and see these changes. It may not show up on a phone, and it may not show up on a Mac or in WordPad. So that's just something to keep in mind. So you may have to go to a computer that has Microsoft Word in order to revise. And I apologize, but that's really the best way that I can open and edit documents. So I have opened up this paper on Mac's equivalent to Microsoft Word. Now you'll notice when you do this out to the side that there may be a set of red lines when you open your document up. Click on those red lines. first of all. And when you click on them, they will open up to show you the edits that you need to make. Now, the Song of the Jellicles, this word is obviously, Microsoft Word is not recognizing it as a legitimate word, so I'm just going to ignore all so that it doesn't get in the way. And that way we can revise. There we go. All right, so whenever you see a line out to the side of the paper, what that means is that there is an error in the sentence, and it will be in red. Now, they can be a little bit hard to spot, so I'm going to zoom in on the font here so they're a little easier to see. Okay, so right here I put a comma because the Song of the Jellicles is added to the sentence, so I need to put it between two commas. So in order to get rid of this line here, to add this into my paper, I'm going to right-click on the red, okay, and you'll notice you have this option. You can accept change or reject change. If you reject the change, that means it will take away what I've edited and strip it away as if it wasn't there before. You can do that. If you do that, I'll still count it wrong, so don't do that. Instead, you'll click accept change, and that will make it part of the paper. So now the text has become black. It is now part of the paper, and as you'll notice, the line is gone, meaning that this change is now incorporated and revised into your draft. So if I do this over here, I can click accept change. The line is gone. The text is added to the poem. All right. Now she did do this in-text citation wrong, so I'm going to change that real quick. Haha. All right. Man, she had a few extra errors here I've got to correct. There we go. All right. So that's just what you got to do. If you want to get rid of a comment, if you're using Mac, you can do this little arrow to accept, and it takes it in there. Or you can right-click on it and do delete comment. There we go. Now, if you've got a bunch of edits in a row like this to make, instead of having to go one by one throughout these, start where the last edit is and highlight up to where the first edit begins. Now, you have to be very particular if you do it this way. You have to start exactly where it ends and keep it right in between these two edits. You can't add this word here or this word here. It has to be very specific. And then you should be able to accept change and get rid of all of that at once. All right. Now, you've just got to be very particular and slow about it in order to get it all right. But if you do that, it will work. Okay. Man, I'm just now noticing all these errors. So yeah, if you edit anything, you'll notice that it makes the text red, and just do that throughout, and you should be fine. Oh my goodness. I picked out this draft because I liked this paper, but this was the draft stage, and so I'm noticing some errors that were still left in it. I tried to correct a few before I showed you all this paper so that it wouldn't take me forever to get through. Alright, so now I'm going through here. So you can see as you correct these, you can see all of your errors, and that way you know exactly what to change for the future. And they put a works cited here at the end. And as you can see, this is an old MLA format. There we go. All right. So, oh, there we go. All right. So this is an example of paper 2. Option 1, you can see that they started out with their introduction paragraph describing the two poems that they are going to compare and contrast, and then they compared and contrasted each poem, and then right at the end, after their conclusion, they created a little sample poem of their own, and then they had their works cited at the end. Now, they did not cite our book here, which they should have, so just make sure that you include your book citation there. But that's pretty much how to revise. Revisions on grammar with your papers will not be hard. If there's anything content-wise you have to change, that will require a little bit more of your time. So I'm going to include this as an example in week 7. I'm going to stay logged in here. So I'm going to go down to our week 7 handouts on our course homepage. And for me, I can add a handout here. I'm going to do example paper number 2, option number 1. And I'm actually going to pick from my documents. There we go. All right, I'm going to put down, this is an example, paper number 2, from semesters prior. Student chose example number 1. I'm going to put it on here, make sure you cite the textbook as well as any outside sources. Okay. All right, so you should be able to see now on week 7. Week 6, we're going to finish up this presentation part 1, and then the option will be there for you to click. And I am going to change this. I forgot that this says September 30th. We're going to change it to next week, which is going to be October 8th. And you'll notice next week there's no discussion forum, but there will be a grammar checkup and reading response 3. So reading response 3 will have some more information on it. So just keep a lookout for that. But I am going to change this revision due date to October 8th. So if you looked at this ahead of time and now you're watching this video and you're like, I thought that it was September 30th, I'm going to change it to the 8th. So don't worry. All right. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, we are going to finish up talking about our poetry section, part 1, chapters 13 through 15. We did in this presentation slides 1 through 7 last week. As you'll notice, we only have slides 8 through 10 this week. Our poetry unit has a lot of examples. A lot. So paper 2 should not be hard in terms of finding examples, especially if you use our textbook, because there is a lot to go off of. And there's not a lot of terminology with chapters 13 through 15, so this presentation will not be as long as next week's will be. Chapters 16 on, there's a bit more terminology in them. So chapter 13 starts out on page 650, and I will open this up, get the big version of it. All right, so chapter 13 is about pattern, and pattern is looking at the entire poem in terms of how it's constructed, so how the rhyme scheme works, how the verse is organized, basically its structure, and how the pattern is set up. So on page 651, we have this lovely jungle gym looking building right there. It kind of looks like a glass pyramid that you see down in Memphis. And they talk about context, which is a web of meaning. And poems really have a lot of context. They have multiple layers to them. I always think of Shrek with the onion metaphor. But it really is. Poems are layered with pattern, with substance, with form, with emotions, with symbolism, with metaphors, with imagery, sensory words. I mean, there's a whole lot going on, or that can be going on, in a very short, concise poem. And so pattern is just getting the whole context, structure of the poem lined out. So in this chapter, it starts out by noting how poets shape their poetry and use pattern. And so the book notes that poems often ask questions. They give the reader something to think about. They can work out answers if they want, but a lot of times poems may even leave questions to the audience and not give them an answer. So that's what can frustrate readers, because typically with a piece of prose, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, two things either happen. Either the audience gets a clear-cut knowledge by the end of the story as to what the theme was, what the purpose was, what the whole point of the piece of prose was, or it's left open to the audience's imagination but that's clear. It's clear that that's what the writer is doing. With poetry, it can often be vague, and vague to the point where readers may not know if it's supposed to be left vague or if there was supposed to be some kind of meaning and maybe I just didn't get it. Poetry can be a lot more subjective than prose can, and some readers get frustrated by that because they want a clear, concrete definition of what the poem represents, and sometimes poets won't do that for us. So poetry can also play off of opposites or polarities. They help us to draw mental maps, comparisons. They can describe one thing here and the total opposite below. Lots of poetry about nature discusses seasons, discusses moods, discusses contrasts, comparisons. It can be a lot more abstract than something that's concrete and easy to define. And they can play off contrasting points of views. So a poem may start at one end of the spectrum and end at another. And like prose, though, sometimes poetry can actually build to a high point and have a climax and a resolution. So we talked last week about Beowulf in its original translation being a poem, and it very much builds to a high point with Grendel's mother and Beowulf conquering and being victorious at the end. So it does build to a high point like a prose story, and it does have a resolution. So poetry kind of does whatever it's intended to, whatever its author needs it to do. And for some readers, that can be overwhelming. And they may question, why can't it just be like a story where there's 3 acts or beginning, middle, end? And poetry sometimes doesn't do that. So on page 653, we talk about how poetry can use closure. So poetry can also have an ending or a resolution. And they give us a few examples, like Wendell Berry's The Peace of the Wild Things, and Archibald, what a classic old-fashioned name, MacLeish's The Genius. And then it shifts over to page 654, where they talk about poems having focus or energy. So you can look through chapter 13 here, and there's a lot of, they give us some examples of concrete poetry. Usually if you think of nature poetry like Frost's poems, or a lot of Victorian 1800s poetry was very much centered on nature, on the environment, on surroundings, and how those surroundings that were concrete actually played into our mood, or things that were abstract, like feelings and emotions. So walking through the woods on a snowy evening, even though Frost's poem is about something very concrete, at the end you kind of get this sense that he's talking about something more than just nature. There's an underlining feeling of something existential that he's kind of tapping into, whether it's about our own mortality, whether it's about happiness and the need to get to home, whatever that sense is, you get the idea that he's not just focused on the physical. There's something else he's trying to tap into. And this chapter kind of highlights several ones of that. Sylvia Plath on page 659 does Frog Autumn, which is a really good poem, if you want to check that one out. On page 660 and 661, they talk about a couple of other things too. They talk about terminology like concrete poetry, which we've talked about concrete in fiction in terms of being physical, tangible things. The use of repetition, where a poet will purposefully repeat words or a certain format in a poem to create an effect, whether it's a rhythm or whether it's to create more impact the more it's read. They will do that. Also parallelism. So the poem starts and ends in a similar way with a similar text. That's something that a poet will do. Oftentimes a poet will use parallelism to show kind of a contrast from start to finish in a poem, where it might end and begin the same way, but your feelings by the end of the poem may be drastically different. Cumulative means that a poem builds to a certain point, so it builds to that climax. And then a counterpoint, though, is the exact opposite of cumulative, where a cumulative poem will do like a roller coaster, and it'll build uphill. A counterpoint is like a pinball machine, where it bounces from point to point as it goes along. So there might not be any build with a counterpoint poem. It just kind of goes from this to this, to this, to this, to this. Okay, hope that my gestures are helpful. Antithesis. We've talked about your thesis. Hopefully I'm going to be reading all of your theses for paper 2 and making sure those all look good. But a thesis is the main idea of a poem. So antithesis is where you take a certain theme or point that your poem is building to, and then the poet intentionally goes the opposite of it. So if the poem is creating this theme of peace and harmony, and then in the last few lines a grenade goes off, that's kind of the antithesis of what the poet has been building, right? So a lot of modern poets, especially slam poetry, things like that, a lot of modern poets will take a theme and then at the last minute turn it on its head to create a very contrasting idea. And usually that's the whole point, is to be dramatic and shock value, throw something shocking at you. Metaphysical, my little box here kind of cuts off that word. Metaphysical is passionate poetry. It analyzes emotions and it rationalizes them. It is the exact opposite of concrete poetry. So concrete poetry is like your nature poetry, poetry that's examining maybe a scene or an atmosphere or a period of time. Metaphysical poetry is all about examining emotions and moods while you read poetry. So it's almost a self-aware poem. It knows what it's trying to do and it's aware of it. And there are definitely more modern poetry that gets metaphysical. All right, so I told you at the beginning of here that chapter 13, 14, 15 had lots of example poetry, which is very true, but not a lot of terminology. So chapter 14 starts on 683, and it is all about image. And image, you will notice, has hardly any terminology other than just what it is. An image is exactly that. It's the visualization we get when we read a poem. And I would like you guys to look at, in our book, the glossy pages. They start after page 698. They're really nice. There's some glossy pages. And they have an image, and then under that image there is a poem. And these images and poems were not created at the same time. What our authors have done is they have found various poems and various pictures through art movements and through various artists, and they've combined them together. And for the most part, if you look through these glossy pages, for the most part these songs and poems match up very well. River Song, The Yellow House, Girl Powdering Her Neck, Vermeer, On Bananas and Grapefruit number 3 especially, and then looking at Classic Scene, Organization, and Kambara. Those all utilize image and poetry very, very well together. And so I would like for you all, for future assignments we're going to be doing in this class, whether they are reading responses or discussion forums, you'll need to look at these glossy pages and these images. But as you look through them, and the poems are extremely short that go with the images, but as you look through them, I would like for you to, read the poems aloud while looking at the images and see if you can notice a connection there, because these weren't just put together by chance. The authors knew exactly what they were doing when they connected these images and these poems together, and there's a reason behind that. And so as we do future assignments looking at these glossy pages, I would encourage you all to read through them. And we do an assignment with these glossy pages and images, and I feel like every semester the class gravitates towards a particular poem or two poems, and it's usually one of the poems is always the same every semester. So I'm curious to see if that happens this time around. So I'll be definitely reviewing your discussion forums and giving you my feedback once I read those. But that's chapter 14. It's all just those images basically, and that's it. chapter 15 starts on page 714, and it is all about metaphor. We've talked about metaphor and simile. Some of you got that answer wrong on the fiction exam, so just to be clear, a metaphor is examining two or more images, comparing and contrasting them, but not using like or as. If you do use like or as, that is a simile. So if I said she's like the wind, that's a simile. But if I say her hair was a bird's nest, that's a metaphor, because I did not use like or as. They do the same thing, just similes use like or as in the comparison. Metaphor does not. So chapter 15 actually starts out by telling us about the differences between metaphor and simile within poetry. One thing that this chapter does advise us to on page 716 is to beware of cliches, especially in poetry. In fiction, I feel like you can kind of get away with it because you can take a cliche in fiction or nonfiction and sort of make it your own, because you have a lot of text and a lot of space and time to do that. With poetry, unless you're writing like an epic ballad like Beowulf, you really don't have a lot of wiggle room to worry about cliches. So, you know, we see a lot of cliche poetry that we often call bad poetry because it's like the same thing we've heard over and over again, like roses are red, violets are blue. It's cliche because it's the kind of pattern and rhyme scheme and imagery we see over and over again, like, oh, like, I'm trying to think of the best metaphor that's cliche, but her hair smelled of roses or something like that. You know, the type of imagery that we've seen over and over again, it becomes cliche and overused, and our book advises us to be careful to try not to do that. Try to be original and unique if you can with your poems, or at least be aware of metaphors and cliches and try not to use them. But speaking of metaphors, there are two types that this chapter really goes over. One is called an extended metaphor, which on page 718 it is described. An extended metaphor is one that is repeated throughout a poem. So the same comparison is made throughout the poem. Like if someone's talking about if it was a poem, let's say, about a flock of ravens, and that being, I'm going to get Edgar Allan Poe-ish on here, if it was like a flock of ravens and it was like a metaphor for death and we kept seeing these ravens throughout the poem, that would be an extended metaphor because it's representing the same thing over and over again. A controlling metaphor is an extended metaphor because that becomes a central theme or the factor that drives the poem. So if that flock of ravens starts to not only be something that pops up in the poem over and over again, but let's say our poem actually has a story. Let's say our poem is about each verse of the poem, a boy is walking through the woods and the ravens are following him. And every time he turns a corner, something happens because of the ravens. Now it's a controlling metaphor. It's not just a comparison that keeps popping up in the poem. It's actually driving the plot of the poem. And that is important. So just extended and controlling metaphors are very similar, and I'm not going to ask you to differentiate them on the exam, but I do want you to know that there is a subtle difference between the two. Extended is just popping up the same metaphor over and over in the poem, but controlling means it actually has an active part in the poem. And so that's the only main difference. It's kind of like open form and free verse. They're very similar, but there's just a subtle difference between the two. Figurative language. We talked about this in fiction. Figurative means that it's comparing something to something that is not real, that is not really there. So it's just taking something that is real in the poem and comparing to something that is not. And that's basically all it amounts to. So the last two terms that chapter 15 talks about on this slide, we see, if you guys can turn to page 728, we talk about conceits and sonnets. I feel like whenever anybody hears the word poetry, they instantly know the word sonnet. Like that's a term that we associate right off the bat with poetry. A sonnet is a structure. It's a type of poem pattern. It is 14 lines, specifically. A poem with 14 lines exactly is a sonnet. Shakespeare wrote a lot of sonnets. So many so that the example on page 729 in our book is William Shakespeare's Sonnet 73. So that means there were 72 sonnets beforehand that he published alone, and more after that. So yes, on page 729, Shakespeare's Sonnet 73 is a great example of a 14-line poem that he has created. And you'll notice the rhyme scheme that he uses throughout this. He does, looking at on page 729 at the last words of his sonnet, we have behold, hang, cold, sang, day, west, away, rest, fire, lie, expire, by, strong, long. So our pattern with this sonnet is A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So there's a specific pattern he gets to it. And that sonnet is only one of the examples. There's actually quite a few in our book to look through. And then the other term they talk about are conceits. And conceits are simply elaborately developed analogies within a poem. And an analogy is like a reference or a comparison. It's not a short one like a metaphor, but it's actually a longer referred story that the poem is trying to talk about. So Shakespeare usually made his sonnets into conceits as well. They were just long story-like poems that just happened to be 14 lines and happened to have a certain rhyme scheme. So Shakespeare was just as elaborate with his poetry as he was his plays, is what you can basically take away from this. So, and you can see Sonnet 29 by Shakespeare is on the next page. Rosemary Cataclos's La Casa is on the next page. John Donne's A Valedictorian, Forbidding Mourning. There's several sonnets to talk about towards the end of the metaphor chapter as well. And so I have actually had students create for their example poem a sonnet, and that worked out just fine. So again, it's entirely up to you for paper 2 how you craft that little example poem you have to make, but sonnet is one of those options that you have. And that's pretty much it for this week. Like I said, only 3 slides there. Chapters 13, 14, and 15 do not have a lot of terminology. Don't worry, next week we will make up for it with the other future chapters. But as always, if you guys have any questions, please let me know. As you probably noticed with week 6, I did not get a chance to go through many of your discussion forums and reply personally. Like I've said in previous posts and videos, I do read every single one of your posts, so please don't feel like I'm not looking at them, because I am. I will definitely try this week. With grading paper 1, I kind of made grading a priority over the discussion forum. So I do apologize for that. But with week 7 and 8, I will be going through your discussion forums, especially with the forum assignments coming up and responding to those. So I just want to give you guys an update on that. But everyone's paper number 1 is graded. It's back to you. If you would like to revise, you are more than welcome to. Like I said, you have until October 8th. I will update our due dates so that it shows that. Just email me your revised papers, and then I will next week in week 8 go over the next couple of chapters in our poetry unit. If you guys have any questions at all, just let me know. But otherwise, have a great week, everyone, and I will talk to you all very soon. Bye.